Pharaoh's officials. In approximately 1155 BCE, one of the most powerful men on earth nearly died in his own bedroom. Ramesses III, ruler of Egypt at the height of its empire, survived an assassination conspiracy, organized not by foreign enemies, but from within the walls of his own palace. A plot hatched by one of his secondary wives, Tiye, who wanted her son placed on the throne instead of the designated heir. What followed was one of the earliest documented royal trials in human history, recorded on what is now called the Turin Judicial Papyrus, a document that survived more than 3,000 years and still sits in a museum in Turin, Italy. Roughly 40 conspirators were brought before a tribunal of judges, appointed by Ramesses himself, and the sentences handed down were calibrated not just to kill, but to humiliate. Many of the condemned had their noses and ears cut off before execution, a punishment designed to mark them permanently as traitors, even in death. Some of the accused, particularly those of higher rank, were permitted to take their own lives rather than face public mutilation, a distinction the Egyptians considered an act of mercy, though by any modern measure, it was simply a cleaner form of compelled death. Most chilling of all was the erasure of identity that the court imposed on several conspirators. Their names were officially altered in the records, changed to mocking substitutes that inverted their original meanings. A man whose name meant something like Ra is beautiful might find it changed to Ra is blind. His very existence in the written record transformed into an insult that would follow him into whatever afterlife the Egyptians believed awaited him. The trial reveals something important about how ancient royal courts understood punishment. Death alone was never enough. The goal was the systematic destruction of a person's legacy, their body, and their name, simultaneously, so that nothing remained that could be honored, mourned, or remembered. Croesus, king of Lydia, the man whose name became a synonym for wealth across the ancient world, lost everything in a single afternoon. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great swept through his kingdom in approximately 547 BCE, and the city of Sardis fell. According to Herodotus, writing several decades after the event, Croesus was condemned to be burned alive on an enormous funeral pyre, a spectacle of Persian dominance, meant to be visible across the captured city, and to make absolutely clear to every watching eye what happened to kings who miscalculated against Persia. The pyre was built on a scale appropriate to the execution of royalty. Massive, deliberate, constructed to burn long and hot. What happened next, Herodotus tells us, is that Croesus stood on the pyre and called out the name of the Athenian sage Solon, who had once visited his court and warned him that no man could be counted happy until his death. Cyrus, curious about what a condemned king would be saying in his final moments, had interpreters explain the story, and was reportedly so moved and perhaps also worried about divine retribution for burning a king that he ordered the fire extinguished. Whether the fire was actually put out or whether this entire episode is a moral fable constructed after the fact by Greek historians is a question scholars have never fully resolved, and Herodotus himself was writing at considerable remove from the events he described. What is less disputed is the broader outline. Sardis fell, Croesus was captured, and his fate became one of the ancient world's most discussed stories, precisely because it illustrated how completely and suddenly a king's fortune could reverse. If Croesus did survive, as some accounts suggest, he spent the rest of his life as an advisor to the very man who had sentenced him to the flames, which, depending on your perspective, is either a remarkable second act or simply a longer and slower form of humiliation. Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who came closer than almost anyone to defeating Julius Caesar, did not die in battle. He died in a stone pit beneath Rome 6 years after his most famous moment, which was itself an act of extraordinary dignity and defeat. In 52 BCE, following the Roman siege of Alesia, he rode into Caesar's camp in full armor, laid his weapons at Caesar's feet, and sat in silence, waiting to be taken prisoner. It was one of the most theatrical surrenders in the ancient world, and Caesar, who had an acute sense of spectacle, recognized its value immediately, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Vercingetorix was kept alive, imprisoned, and transported to Rome, where he was held in the Tullianum, the city's most notorious underground prison, a circular stone chamber barely large enough to stand in, dug into the base of the Capitoline Hill. He waited there for 6 years while Caesar fought other wars, survived other crises, and eventually organized the grandest military triumph Rome had yet seen. In 46 BCE, Vercingetorix was finally brought out, chained and paraded through the streets of Rome in front of tens of thousands of citizens who had grown up hearing about the great Gallic Wars. He was displayed as a trophy, a proof of Roman dominance over the barbarian world, a king reduced to a prop in someone else's celebration. When the parade ended, he was taken back to the Tullianum and strangled by a Roman executioner, the the standard method for enemies of state, quick in itself, but delivered only after years of calculated psychological erosion. Caesar was assassinated less than 2 years later, which means Vercingetorix outlived his captor's political supremacy, even if he did not outlive the triumph. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had been Queen of England for approximately 1,000 days when Henry VIII decided he was done with her. The charges brought against her in the spring of 1536 adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and high treason are rejected by virtually every serious historian who has examined the evidence, which is to say that what happened on Tower Green on the morning of May 19, 1536, was not an execution in any meaningful legal sense, but a judicially costumed murder carried out with extraordinary efficiency. Anne was arrested, tried, and condemned in 19 days. The men accused alongside her were executed first, one by one, in the days before her own death. Henry VIII, who retained enough residual concern for appearances to want the thing done neatly, had originally scheduled Anne for burning the lawful punishment for a woman convicted of treason in England at the time, before personally commuting the sentence to beheading, a change he apparently offered as an act of mercy. He then arranged for a professional swordsman to be brought from Calais specifically for the execution, because English executioners used axes, which frequently required multiple strikes and produced results that were messy even by the standards of Tudor public death. A sword, in the hands of someone who knew what he was doing, was theoretically cleaner and faster. On the morning of her execution, Anne Boleyn removed her headdress herself, tucked her hair away beneath a linen coif with her own hands, and kept her eyes open and fixed ahead as she knelt. She had spoken publicly of Henry's goodness on the scaffold, a statement so divorced from the reality of her situation that historians still debate whether it was sincere, strategic, or simply the only thing a woman in her position could safely say in front of witnesses. The sword fell, and the thing was done, and Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour within 11 days. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a prisoner for 18 years and 11 months by the time the axe fell at Fotheringhay Castle on the morning of the 8th of February, 1587. And even at the end, she managed to make the occasion about something larger than herself. She dressed for her execution in deliberate and visible layers. The outer gown was black, formal, and appropriate to the solemnity of the moment. But beneath it, she wore crimson, the Catholic liturgical color of martyrdom, so that when the black was removed in preparation for the blow, everyone in the Great Hall would see exactly what she was claiming for herself in death. She was 44 years old, her hair completely gray and cropped short beneath the auburn wig she wore in public, a detail that became one of the execution's most remembered moments, when the executioner lifted her severed head and the wig came away in his hand, leaving the assembled witnesses staring at something quite different from the queen they thought they knew. The execution itself was a disaster of technique. The first stroke of the axe missed her neck and struck the back of her skull. The second cut through most of the neck, but not completely. A third stroke was required to finish the separation. By any measure, it was an agonizing and botched proceeding, carried out in front of witnesses who included her own servants, representatives of the English crown, and the sheriff of Northamptonshire. Her small dog, which had traveled beneath her skirts undetected throughout the entire proceedings, was found after the execution crouched between her head and her shoulders, and reportedly had to be physically removed from the body. Elizabeth I, who had delayed signing the death warrant for months and then claimed her secretary had sent it without final authorization, was said to have wept when news of the execution reached her, though how genuine that grief was has been argued about ever since. Charles I. The execution of Charles I on January 30, 1649, outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, was something that had never happened in England before, and that most people in Europe genuinely believed was impossible. A reigning king, tried by his own subjects, convicted of tyranny against his own people, and publicly beheaded in the street. Charles refused throughout his trial to recognize the court's authority over him, arguing with considerable philosophical consistency that no earthly tribunal had jurisdiction over an anointed monarch, and so he never entered a plea and was condemned without technically having been heard in his own defense. On the morning of his execution, he dressed with unusual care and wore 2 shirts. The January air was bitterly cold, and he told his attendants that if he shivered, the crowd might mistake it for fear, and he would not have that. The executioner and his assistant both wore disguises, wigs, and false beards, because whoever killed a king would be identified and remembered, and no one wanted to be that person. The true identity of Charles's executioner remains genuinely disputed by historians to this day, with Richard Brandon being the most commonly cited candidate, but the evidence being less than conclusive. A crowd packed into Whitehall to watch, numbers that contemporary accounts put in the tens of thousands, pressed tight against the barriers in the pale winter morning. When the executioner raised the severed head and declared it the head of a traitor, The crowd responded not with cheers, but with what multiple witnesses described as a low, collective groan, a sound they said was unlike anything they had heard before. The execution sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe, forced a generation of political thinkers to confront questions about the source of sovereign authority, and directly shaped how constitutional monarchies negotiated with parliaments for the next 200 years. Louis XVI. The vote that decided the death of Louis XVI was 361 to 360, one vote. In December 1792, the French National Convention debated not just whether the king was guilty. That vote was unanimous, but whether execution was the appropriate sentence, and the margin by which France chose to guillotine its king rather than imprison or exile him was a single delegate changing his mind. Louis was taken to the Place de la Révolution on the morning of the 21st of January 1793, the largest public square in Paris, which had been packed since before dawn with tens of thousands of citizens. He attempted to speak from the scaffold. Drummers were ordered to drown him out, and whether any of his final words reached the crowd before the drum roll swallowed them is something eyewitness accounts contradict each other on entirely. The guillotine, which the revolutionary government had adopted partly on the grounds that it was more humane and more egalitarian than execution methods that varied by social class, still required the condemned to be physically prepared, hair cut at the nape, collar stripped away, hands bound behind the back. Louis resisted the binding of his hands and had to be persuaded by his confessor, the Abbé Edgeworth, to submit. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, whose family had held the office of royal executioner for generations, an irony that was not lost on observers, lifted the head to the crowd. Multiple accounts describe people rushing forward to dip handkerchiefs and scraps of cloth in the blood pooling on the platform, and some reports claim that individuals tasted it, though historians treat the more extreme accounts with appropriate caution. Marie Antoinette was guillotined 9 months later in the same square. Conradin. Conradin was 16 years old and the last legitimate heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty when Charles of Anjou had him beheaded in the public marketplace of Naples on the 29th of October, 1268, in what many contemporary observers and later historians described as one of the most legally and morally controversial royal executions of the entire medieval period. Conradin had crossed the Alps with an army to reclaim the Italian territories his family had ruled for generations, was defeated at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, and was captured shortly afterward when soldiers recognized him attempting to flee by boat. Charles of Anjou's own advisors reportedly urged caution. Executing a crowned king, even a defeated one, was unprecedented in a way that made people nervous, and one judge, Robert of Bari, is said in chronicle accounts to have refused to sign the death warrant and had his hand severed for the refusal, though this story comes from medieval sources and should be understood as belonging to a tradition of exemplary narrative rather than verified court record. Conradin was brought to the Campo Moricino with his companion Frederick of Baden and several other captured nobles. According to the Chronicle of Saba Malaspina, before he knelt for the executioner, Conradin threw his glove into the watching crowd as a gesture designating an heir to avenge him, a piece of theater so perfectly suited to his situation that historians have argued about whether it happened or whether it was added afterward by chroniclers who couldn't resist the symbolism. Pope Clement IV, who had politically enabled Charles's invasion of southern Italy and therefore bore some responsibility for the chain of events that ended here, reportedly called Charles a butcher rather than a king upon hearing news of the execution, a condemnation that would have carried more weight had it come before the fact. Conradin's death ended a dynasty and left a political vacuum in southern Italy that reverberated for decades. Maximilian I of Mexico. Archduke Maximilian of Austria was, by most accounts, a genuinely well-intentioned man placed on a throne by a foreign military power and then abandoned there when the political calculations of Napoleon III shifted, and French troops were withdrawn from Mexico in 1866 and 1867. Without French support, his empire lasted months. He was captured, tried by a military court, and sentenced to death, and the sentence prompted an extraordinary round of international appeals. The governments of Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, and Italy all urged President Benito Juarez to show clemency, and the Italian nationalist hero Garibaldi sent a personal plea. Juarez refused, arguing with considerable force that sparing a foreign-imposed emperor would send a signal to every European power that Mexico was available for future experiments in colonization. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1867, on the Hill of the Bells outside Querétaro the Cerro de las Campañas, Maximilian was led out alongside 2 of his Mexican generals. He tipped each member of his firing squad with a gold coin and asked them, as his final request, to aim for his chest rather than his face so that his mother in Vienna could have an open casket viewing. The firing squad did not kill him cleanly. A coup de grace shot at close range was required. Maximilian was 34 years old. The French painter Édouard Manet, who received news of the execution as it was spreading across Europe, was sufficiently disturbed by it that he painted the scene 4 times, producing what became among the most politically charged artworks of the 19th century. The canvases now split between institutions, including the Kunsthal Hamburg and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The executions of his 2 generals, carried out simultaneously, received considerably less international attention. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq for more than 2 decades through methods that included the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations, the systematic torture and murder of political opponents, and a cult of personality maintained through total control of state media. He was captured, hiding in a hole in the ground near his hometown of Tikrit in December 2003, tried before the Iraqi Special Tribunal for Crimes Against Humanity, specifically related to the Dujail massacre, the killing of 148 Shia men and boys from the town of Dujail, following a 1,982 assassination attempt, and sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was carried out on the 30th of December 2006 at Camp Justice in Baghdad. December 30 fell at the beginning of Eid al-Adha, one of the holiest observances in the Islamic calendar, and executing anyone during Eid, let alone a former head of state who retained considerable support among Iraq's Sunni population, was interpreted by many as a deliberate sectarian provocation rather than a matter of judicial scheduling. Saddam refused a hood. He was filmed by official cameras. But what the world actually saw was footage captured on a mobile phone by someone in the execution chamber and leaked within hours. Footage that showed guards and officials chanting the name of Muqtada al-Sadr as the noose was placed around Saddam's neck, Sadr being the Shia cleric whose father Saddam had ordered killed. The taunting is clearly audible on the recording. Saddam can be heard responding with a question about whether this is considered manly behavior. He recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, and the trapdoor opened. The Iraqi government announced an investigation into who filmed and leaked the footage. A guard was eventually identified and prosecuted. Human Rights Watch called for a full investigation into the circumstances of the execution, noting that the conduct of those present raised serious questions about the proceedings. Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya for 42 years, longer than most of the people who eventually pulled him from a drainage culvert outside Sirte had been alive. He was found on the 20th of October 2011, wounded but alive, hiding in a concrete drainage pipe after NATO airstrikes destroyed his convoy as it attempted to evacuate the city. Rebel fighters from the National Transitional Council dragged him out, and what happened next was filmed on multiple mobile phones simultaneously. The footage broadcast globally within hours and watched by millions before any official account had been released. In the videos, Gaddafi is visible being beaten, shoved, and pulled through the dust, his gold-trimmed uniform torn, his face bloodied. He can be heard asking, repeatedly, what he has done to deserve this treatment, a question that struck many observers as either genuinely disoriented or extraordinarily detached from reality, given the nature of his 4-decade rule. He was shot, and the official cause of death was recorded as a gunshot wound to the head, though the exact sequence of events, whether the shot was deliberate execution or the chaotic result of a violent crowd, was never definitively established, despite an announced investigation by the NTC that produced no significant conclusions. Human Rights Watch documented the circumstances of his death and called for an investigation into whether it constituted a war crime under international law, a characterization that remains a legal framing rather than an adjudicated verdict. His body was then transported to Misrata, where it was placed in a refrigerated storage unit in a commercial building and put on public display for several days. Crowds lining up in the desert heat to file past and view the remains of the man who had governed their country since 1969. International criticism of the display was swift and largely ignored. The Romanovs, Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, their son and heir Alexei, their family physician, Dr. Eugene Botkin, and 3 servants, were woken at midnight on July 16 to 17, 1918, told to dress quickly, and brought to the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, under the explanation that they were being photographed for their safety. Chairs were brought in. The family arranged themselves as if for a portrait. Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik commandant responsible for their custody, entered with a squad of 11 men and read a brief statement declaring that the Ural Soviet had condemned them to death. Nicholas had time to say only, "What?" before the shooting began. What followed was not an efficient execution, but something closer to a confined catastrophe. The 4 daughters had jewels sewn into the linings of their corsets, an escape fund assembled over months of captivity, and the gems deflected bullets in a sealed basement room, rounds ricocheting off corset stays and off walls while the girls screamed. Executioners later described the scene as chaotic and nightmarish, the smoke from the guns making it difficult to see, the noise in the confined space overwhelming. The execution descended into stabbing and bludgeoning. Yurovsky's own written account, produced after the fact, records that the entire process from the reading of the sentence to the deaths of all 11 people in the room took approximately 20 minutes. The bodies were removed to the forest outside the city, doused in sulfuric acid, partially burned, and buried in 2 separate locations, specifically to prevent any grave from becoming a site of royalist veneration. The remains were discovered in 1979 by amateur investigators and officially identified through DNA analysis in the 1990s. The story that Anastasia had escaped was definitively disproven by that forensic identification, a conclusion that closed one of the 20th century's most persistent myths. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.